All right, so we can go ahead and get started here. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ethan, and I'm the president of the Ratio Christi chapter here at U of M in Ann Arbor. And so before we get into the talk, I just want to really briefly say a little bit about Ratio Christi, and then also give some background on Neil. So this event is hosted by Michigan Ratio Christi. We're made up of chapters at the University of Michigan Ann Arbor, the University of Michigan Dearborn, Western Michigan University, and Grand Valley State University. Ratio Christi is a college student organization, and our main goal is to answer tough questions through apologetics. So that's philosophy, science, history, biblical study, all to kind of reconcile those disciplines and help kind of make a case for the faith in Christ. And so we hope to grow in our own beliefs, but then we also hope to evangelize and share them with others. So that's kind of how this event ties into what we're doing. So I'll put the Ratio Christi link to their website and then also my email in case anyone has any questions after the event or is more interested in the organization itself. And then as for our speaker, we're joined by Dr. Neil Shenvy today. Neil earned his PhD in theoretical chemistry from UC Berkeley, and then he's had postgrad training in quantum chemistry. He's spoken and written extensively on a number of topics, and that includes science, sociology, and then also the relationship between Christianity and social issues. So tonight, Neil will specifically be speaking on the topic of justice, as you've seen in the heading. That's because there's been a lot of discussion in our country about justice, and particularly in relation to race. And so we thought that that would be a great topic for Neil to show us, since he's educated in the topic, he's experienced. And so we thought that it would be great to hear how the Christian worldview should guide us to move towards justice that is in line with biblical teaching. And so he'll start out with a talk for about an hour, and then we'll move into a question and answer time after that. And so you may have seen the question and the answer option in the bottom of your Zoom. So if at any point in the meeting you want to ask a question, feel free to do that. And I believe that's it. So without any further delay, Dr. Neil Shenvy.
Thank you, Ethan. So I'll just throw my slides up here and we'll get started. Here we go. Can you see that? I'm assuming you can see that. I'll make it large. Oops. Okay. Right. So my name is Neil Shenvy, and I do have a PhD in theoretical chemistry, which has nothing to do with what I'll be talking about tonight. But don't worry too much. I have a fair bit of reading, and hopefully I have some coherent thoughts. So we're asking the question, does Christianity promote or prevent justice? That's a pretty important question in today's climate. And I'd like to say, why not both? You say, wait, what, both? Does it promote? You're a Christian. You should be saying it promotes justice. Christianity is great for justice. When I say, well, that depends. Right? What do you mean depends? Well, it depends on how you define justice, right? If you define justice in a biblical way, then of course Christianity promotes justice. God is a just and holy God, and that's a very important component of who he is. It's his nature. On the other hand, if you define justice in a wrong or unbiblical way, then maybe Christianity will not be promoting that kind of justice. In the same way, you could ask, does Christianity promote or prevent truth? Well, it all depends on whether Christianity is true. If it is true, then yes, Christianity promotes truth. But if Christianity is false, then it doesn't promote truth. So we have to start by asking, what do you mean by justice? That'll take a big section of our talk. So I want to contrast two major ways of thinking about justice, both of which are important today. The first is what I'll call biblical justice. That simply means applying a biblical understanding of justice to our laws, to our behavior, to our moral choices. The second then would be what's called social justice many times today, or secular social justice, which is another kind of approach to justice that's rooted in something called critical theory. Now, I understand that many Christians will use the phrase social justice to refer to biblical justice, but for tonight, I'm going to use those two terms to label two different approaches to justice. Now, I said that secular social justice is rooted in something called critical theory. Now, what's that? Is that critical race theory? What does that mean exactly? Well, I'll go on a long digression to explain the ideological foundations of this secular social justice. What do they mean by justice? How do they define it? What are the assumptions that go into that model of justice? And after I do that, I'll step back and then say, does that other model, it's very popular today among progressives especially, does that model of progressive secular social justice, does that actually give us true justice, or does it not? And I'm going to argue that it doesn't. And then I'll go back to the question, well, then can a Christian approach to justice give us what we normally think of as social justice, meaning concern for the poor and the vulnerable, and just laws and institutions in addition to just individual behavior? So I want to, again, at the end say, can we talk about social justice issues from a Christian perspective? Okay, in the next section, I'll then say, okay, we've assumed throughout this talk so far that justice is a real, meaningful concept, but can we do that? Wait, where does justice come from? And I'll deal with some of the questions that come up if we try to approach justice from an atheistic or naturalistic perspective. And then in the third section, I'll talk about how Christianity offers some unique ways to think about justice that other religions simply don't, because of just the very nature of how Christianity views things like morality and God's justice. And then I'll close with very briefly some acknowledgements and additional resources. Okay, let's dive right in. So what is biblical justice? Well, I think we can use the traditional definition. I think it goes back to Aristotle, that says that justice is giving to each person what they're due. I think that encapsulates really what the Bible has to say about justice. Now, that there are many sides to that statement. For example, justice includes things like protecting the vulnerable. Isaiah says, learn to do good, seek justice. How? Correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. So throughout the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, we see God specially concerned with his followers protecting the vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, the immigrant, the alien, the stranger. He's always saying to his people, do not exploit them, protect them, lift them up. Now, this is one aspect of justice, but another aspect of biblical justice would be judging impartially. So in Leviticus 19, we see it says, you shall do no injustice in court. What does that mean? Well, you shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. Now, wait a minute. Does that contradict the first point? I mean, how can I show no partiality and yet also care for the vulnerable? Well, here we realize that no, God's not saying we should have different moral standards for the rich and the poor. He's saying he's specially concerned with the vulnerable. Why? Because they're the ones who are most likely to be oppressed and taken advantage of. So if you ask, well, do I have to defend the rights of the powerful? Well, yes, but usually they can defend themselves. They have power. The rich, the powerful, they can look out for their own interests, usually. But the people that are on the outsides, on the margins, they're the ones that are special objects of concern. Why? Because they are powerless, because they can't defend themselves. And therefore, we are to take up their cause, not by showing partiality, treating them unfairly, but by making sure that they have what they're due in terms of their rights. So that's the second aspect. And the third aspect of biblical justice is punishing evil. So the Bible says that God gave us human governments in order to promote the good and to punish the evil. That might be popular today, but we have to think about this. Do we really want to live in a state of anarchy in which evil goes unpunished? Do we really want murderers and child molesters and rapists to run around free to terrorize people? No, because God loves human beings, that is why he is opposed to evil and opposed to injustice and wants it punished. So these three components all are part of a biblical view of justice: protecting the vulnerable, judging impartially, and punishing evil. Now, in contrast to that approach to justice, there's another one that's very popular today, which I'll call secular social justice. Now, the progressives who embrace this ideology often define social justice as the elimination of all forms of social oppression. That's a phrase from Mary McClintock's essay, Disrupting Oppressive Behavior. Now, what do they mean by oppression? Well, they mean injustice based on a person's race, class, sexuality, gender, physical ability, national status, etc. So there are these axes along which injustice and discrimination can be expressed, and social justice is achieved when all those forms of oppression are dismantled. Now, this form of social justice is based on an ideology known as critical theory. And to really understand what people mean when they talk about social justice in this sense, we have to begin looking at what critical theory is. So, long digression. what on earth is critical theory? Is it critical race theory? Is that what you're talking about? I'm saying, no, that's not quite it. Listen, here's a 5-minute overview of a very complicated subject. Critical theory can refer narrowly to a group of philosophers and sociologists known as the Frankfurt School, who wrote in the 30s and 40s in Germany and then moved to the United States. People like Horkheimer, Marcuse, and Benjamin. But since then, since the 30s and 40s, critical theory has spawned entire disciplines like cultural studies, queer theory, critical pedagogy, neo-Marxism, feminism, gender studies, critical race theory, critical legal studies, and so on and so on. So all of these entire disciplines would be under the umbrella heading of critical theory or critical social theories, say. And now, why would they be included under the same heading? And the answer is they're all concerned with how power circulates in subtle ways within society to produce and reproduce social inequality and oppression. This idea really goes back to Karl Marx, but it has been adopted and adapted many times in the intervening decades. So all of these theories, including critical race theory, would be under the broad umbrella heading of critical theory. So today, when people talk about critical theory or critical social theory, the things we're seeing in society, in our culture today, what are those ideas that are central to this enterprise? I'm going to list these four core ideas that are central to contemporary critical theory, sometimes called critical social justice. So what are these four ideas? The first is the social binary. So contemporary critical theorists believe that society can be divided into oppressor groups and oppressed groups along lines of race, class, sex, sexuality, religion, physical ability, nationality, and things like that. So along all these categories, you have oppressor dominant agent groups like whites, the rich, men, heterosexuals, Christians, the able-bodied, etc. And you also have minoritized, target, or oppressed groups, people of color, the poor, women, transgender people, gays and lesbians, non-Christians, people with disabilities, immigrants, and so forth. This is a figure actually taken from the book Is Everyone Really Equal by a woman named Robin DiAngelo. We'll get to her later again. Gets the first premise. So society is divided into oppressor groups and oppressed groups along lines of race, class, gender, and so forth. Now, by the way, you can be part of both an oppressor group and an oppressed group. So, for example, a white woman would be oppressed with respect to her gender because she's a woman, but she'd be an oppressor with respect to her race because she's white. So this is the idea of intersectionality, that the overlap of the various groups to which you belong will mean that your experiences are somehow unique. Experiences of power and oppression are distinct based on your various oppressed and oppressor categories. Second, oppression occurs not through tyranny or coercion or violence or cruelty, but through what Iris Young calls the everyday practices of a well-intentioned liberal society. So we used to think of oppression in terms of like slavery, brutality, theft, violence. But she says now its causes are embedded in unquestioned norms, habits, and symbols. So it's subtle. So all of these oppressed groups are not being overtly mistreated, but are actually, they're part of a system which disguises the ways in which are taken for granted norms and values are actually justifying this structure that separates groups into dominant groups and oppressed groups. So it's all sometimes called hegemonic power. The dominant groups, the ruling classes, have what's called hegemonic power as they impose their white, Western, male, heterosexual values on the rest of society. Third, lived experience. The idea of here is that lived experience gives oppressed groups special insight into truths about their oppression. So privileged oppressor groups actually are blinded by their privilege because they have both conscious and subconscious reasons to ignore the reality of oppression. On the other hand, people that are oppressed from oppressed groups, they have internalized oppression. They are also socialized into the patriarchy or into white supremacy or into heteronormativity. So they're also blinded at first, but through their lived experience, they can come to what's called a liberatory consciousness or a critical consciousness. Colloquially, they can get woke and realize they're living in a suppressive society. And because of that, people from oppressor groups should defer to their lived experiences and their knowledge about their own oppression. And here's a great quote from Anderson and Collins' Race, Class, and Gender. They write, "The idea that objectivity is best reached only through rational thought is a specifically Western and masculine way of thinking, one that we will challenge throughout this book." And they challenge this idea of objectivity, in scare quotes there, through the lived experiences, the stories, the narratives of marginalized people. And that's one of the ways they do it. So they're challenging what we think of as objective and natural and normal is actually the dominant culture's values being imposed on us. And we have to defer to people at the margins and hear their voices because they'll offer us a counter narrative that challenges these taken for granted values. And finally, the goal of contemporary critical theory is the achievement of social justice, which, as we saw, is defined as the elimination of all forms of social oppression, which can be based on a person's race, class, gender, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, physical or mental ability, or economic class. And you can add a number of other factors you could add on to oppressed categories that's often used by critical theorists. So these are the four basic ideas on which secular social justice is based, at least in large factions of the progressive end of the political spectrum. So now that's clearly a different understanding of justice than we see in, say, the Bible, the biblical justice. Here's the question. Is it possible that secular social justice will actually lead to, real flourishing of human beings? And I think the answer is pretty clearly no. And let me show you some examples of these ideas taken to their logical conclusion. And these are pretty common and you're seeing them more frequently today as more and more people embrace this critical theoretic paradigm. So first, we have children as an oppressed group. So here's a quote from Blood, Tuttle, and Lakey. They write, "People are just beginning to have a glimpse of what oppression based on age involves. Children are being considered helpless, dependent, and cute, creatures to be cherished and taken care of, but not full human beings to be deeply respected and trusted with significant power. They experience 10 to 15 years of unpaid labor and brainwashing in our current form of education." Now, I don't know about you, but my kids don't do a lot of unpaid labor. Look at their rooms, right? So I don't know what he's talking about exactly, but more significantly, this is a terrible and poisonous way to think about human relationships. I don't love my kids and feed my kids and care for my kids and change their diapers when they're little and even discipline them. I don't do any of that in order to exploit or oppress them. I'm not getting a lot of unpaid labor out of them, frankly. I do it because I love them. I want what's best for them. So viewing all human relationships, even parent-child relationships, even husband-wife relationships through the lens of power dynamics is poisonous. Honestly, how much more cynical can you get than to see the deepest human relationships merely as expressions and exertions of oppression? That will poison your marriage, your family, your friendships. It will poison everything. We'll see that as we go on. Here's another example. The Smithsonian Institute, it's the National Smithsonian Museum, the Museum of African American History and Culture, last summer put out an infographic on aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture. Now, in that infographic published by the Smithsonian, they listed objective, rational, linear thinking, cause and effect relationships, and quantitative emphasis as elements of whiteness. They also said that it was white culture to emphasize the nuclear family and to believe things like hard work is the key to success. That is a white value or value of white culture. Now, I could expect to see statements like that on a neo-Nazi manifesto, but from the Smithsonian in a purportedly progressive and anti-racist document. That's crazy. That's frankly deeply insulting. But you really think that, say, Asians or Africans don't work hard as the key to success? That's a thing they picked up from white people. That again, that's so demeaning. And yet, how do we think this is progressive? Okay, so I'm just showing you this is not an aberration. This is the way that critical theorists tend to think about cultural issues. Okay. Here's another example. This is Robin DiAngelo. This is the author of the best-selling book, White Fragility, which was, again, the #1 Amazon bestseller of the summer. This is from her peer-reviewed paper, Beyond the Face of Race, Emo-Cognitive Explorations of White Neurosis and Racial Cray-Cray. In that paper, she says lots of things, but here's one of the things she says. Thandika argues that raising white children to be white is a form of child abuse. Now, she's going to work towards a new approach to racial healing. Now, how is she going to achieve racial healing? Well, by affirming Thandika's postulation of whiteness as a form of child abuse that makes white people cray-cray. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think that we're going to achieve a lot of racial healing by telling white parents that raising their white children to be white people is a form of child abuse. Now, again, she has redefined all of those words in pretty cray-cray ways throughout the paper, but I'm just pointing out to you that this approach to justice and racial justice, class justice, child justice, this is a dangerous and poisonous way to think about reality. Here's another example from CNN a few weeks ago. CNN was writing a news piece, not an op-ed piece, a news piece about some transgender legislation passed, I think, in Arkansas. In that news article, they wrote this: it's not possible to know a person's gender identity at birth, and there is no consensus criteria for assigning sex at birth. That is biological sex. There's no consensus about how to assign biological sex. Now, I have kids in the range of ages 6 through 12, and if CNN would like some help figuring out how to assign biological sex at birth, I'm pretty sure my 6-year-old even could give them some hints. My wife is a doctor, so she could probably give you even better hints. But this is crazy. Now, we're not talking here about, again, gender as distinct from sex even. We're talking about how we assign biological sex. And again, in 99.99% of cases, that can easily be done by genital inspection, whether the boy has the male parts. I don't know if I can say that on Zoom or not. I'll get censored by somebody. But or the female parts. But that's how you assign biological sex. They want to deny that biological sex is a clear category. But when again, 99.99% of the times, it is visibly identifiable, and obviously chromosomally, it's almost always identifiable. There are very rare cases where you have some sort of unusual chromosomal abnormalities. But the point is, this is, if you know the queer theory literature, this, first of all, distinction between gender and sex is coming from queer theory. And second of all, the desire to even problematize biological sex, biology, is coming from queer theory for reasons I can explain later. Anyway, but my point is, you're losing touch with reality here. We're losing touch with reality for the sake of a particular political and philosophical ideology. And it has real world consequences. Here's another example. The ACLU a few months ago tweeted out that trans athletes, specifically trans women, that is biological males who would like to identify as females, trans athletes do not have an unfair advantage in sports. So there's, as many of you probably know, there's a big push to allow trans women, that is biological men who identify as women, to play in female sports and to compete with other biological women. But here they're not asking primarily about policy. They're not saying, well, there's got to be a way to work this out. They're not asking that. They're saying it's not true that they have an unfair advantage in sports. Now, guys, again, we're losing touch with reality. There's a really fascinating site called Boys versus Women, and it compares Olympic women's finalists in various sports and events to high school boys finalists. So here's an example of the 800-meter event in track. They compare the 8 top high school boy finishers with the top 2016 Olympic women's finishers. What they find is that the boys get all the top spots over the Olympic women. And what's more, they have a footnote here. None of the women's finals performance met the qualifying time to enter the boys' competition. Now, again, I'm not even making a statement here about policy or how we should think about transgender with regard to sports. I'm merely pointing out that it is simply a denial of reality to not recognize that biological men do indeed have an advantage over biological women in the vast majority of sports. And there's so much data on this. We're losing touch with reality. So, and the bottom line is this: whenever you embrace a false idea, an idea that conflicts with reality, it will end up hurting people. You cannot achieve justice by ignoring reality. As many people have said, reality is what you bump into when you embrace false ideas. You can't carry them out consistently because reality will always thwart your ideology. And to the extent we build our politics or our culture or morality on falsehood, it will hurt people, real people, and that should affect how we think about justice. Okay, so is there a Christian approach to social justice? I'm kind of, I've knocked quote unquote secular social justice. Well, how should Christians think about social justice? Let me outline 6 biblical principles and then think about some conclusions we can draw. So the first 3 are kind of liberal sounding principles that are drawn from the Bible. The second set of 3 principles, the 4 through 6, are going to be conservative sounding principles from the Bible. So first, all people are made in God's image. Rich or poor, black or white, Hispanic, Asian, male, female, young or old, all of us are made in God's image and therefore possess intrinsic dignity. Now, this is the basis for any, solid, robust view of human rights, because we have, God-given rights and dignity that none of us dare violate. Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? He said, well, the first commandment is love God with all your heart. But the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. Love them, be concerned for them. Love them as you love yourself. So give them the very same treatment that you would want to receive from them. So this idea that we're made in God's image, therefore worthy of respect and dignity, is crucial for building all subsequent laws and principles and institutions on that fundamental idea of the imago Dei. That's, again, it's very crucial to understanding the biblical view of humanity. Second, all people, not just Christians, all people are morally obligated to love and protect the vulnerable. Now, again, this is not partiality. We're not saying that the poor and the oppressed have different standards of morality. We're saying that because they're uniquely in danger of having their rights trampled upon, therefore, all the rest of us who are not poor and who have power should use that power to protect those who are powerless to protect themselves. Again, the Bible is filled with commands to look after, to care for the widow, the orphan, the alien, the stranger, the poor, and to break their chains, to free them from bondage when they're being oppressed. So again, that's a biblical principle. That sounds, you're like, oh, that sounds liberal. Well, no, it's not liberal. It's biblical. Third, some sort of very conservative or very radical libertarians will say, no, government's only job is basically to, maybe to build roads or to keep you from killing your neighbor. That's kind of your only function of government, is to keep people from murdering each other. But government should never try to enact laws that promote social welfare. You're violating the roles of government. Well, that can't be true. Now, why not? Well, in the Old Testament, God created the laws of ancient Israel. He wrote the laws. They're God's laws. And when he wrote the laws for ancient Israel, he wrote legislation that protected the vulnerable. For example, the ancient Israelites were mainly farmers. They were not allowed to once they reaped their fields, once they reaped the grain or they gathered in the crops, they could not go back a second time to make sure they hadn't missed anything. They couldn't do that. They were to leave the gleanings for the poor and the alien and the stranger, the immigrants, basically. And God said, I know to be efficient, you want to go back and make sure you didn't miss anything, but you are to leave them so that the poor people can have dignity, can gather their own food and provide for themselves. And there are laws like that. There were provisions for giving to the Levites, and the Levites would then give to the poor. So there were laws when God created a government, when God created laws and gave them to the Israelites. There were indeed provisions for the protection and care of the poor and vulnerable. So we can't therefore say no, that's not the role of government. Well, there's at least one government that contradicts that, which is the government of ancient Israel. Okay, so those are three sort of liberal leaning ideas. Well, here are three conservative leaning ideas. The first of all, God's commands to ancient Israel cannot be taken a one-to-one into modern day. Now, why do I say that? Well, you'll often hear, actually both Christians who are liberal and conservative, you'll often hear them appealing to the Old Testament law and saying, see, Israel had this law, we should have one like it today. Now, we can't do that. Now, why not? Well, think about it. Say liberal Christians might say, well, love and protection for the vulnerable is morally obligatory. I agree with that. It is. We ought to care for the vulnerable. But also they'll say the Old Testament law enshrined this protection into the government, right? It did, and I agree. They say, therefore, we in 21st century America ought to have laws that mandate love and protection for the vulnerable. Here's the problem. That reasoning doesn't work. Why? Well, use something else. Adultery is morally wrong. It is. Prohibition of adultery is part of Mosaic law. It also is. It was punishable by death. Does it follow, therefore, that we should have laws against adultery? Even more. Idolatry, worshiping idols, is morally wrong. It was forbidden and punishable by death under the Mosaic law. Therefore, should we create laws against idolatry today? Well, you see, that reasoning just doesn't work. And that's my next point. Not everything that is immoral should be illegal. Now, everybody believes this, right? No one thinks you ought to make it illegal to be proud. Being prideful is a sin. Being jealous is a sin. Being angry is often a sin. You hate your brother in your heart. Jesus says it's like murdering them. But no one thinks we ought to have a government office in charge of thought crimes, right? So we have to be and everybody realizes that not everything that is immoral should be illegal. Some things should be. Murder is immoral, and murder ought to be illegal. But I'm pointing out that it's sometimes difficult to draw the line, and Christians throughout history have argued about which immoral actions ought to be legislated by the government. That's a tricky question. And again, you'd be surprised by how Christians have gone back and forth on really what seem to us like strange issues today. They've actually argued on both sides of those throughout history. A famous example would be that Thomas Aquinas believed that prostitution should be legal, right? And he's not a minor theologian. So even on the issue of prostitution, Christians have fallen on different sides of whether it should be illegal or not. Now, I think it should be. My point is just this: where you draw the line has to be supplied by argumentation and evidence, not just sort of fiat. And now, why is that? Here's the last point that I think is actually an important insight that's drawn from libertarian and conservative scholars. Finally, all legal compulsion is through the threat of force. And that's why we should always be hesitant to make any law, even small ones. Now, you think all laws are compelled by? No, that can't be true. Well, let me give you an example. Imagine I made it illegal to chewed gum on the sidewalk. So I'm walking down the street one day and I say, well, your law is stupid. I chew some gum, I throw it on the sidewalk, and a cop sees me and he says, sir, that's illegal. You can't do that. I'll let you off right now, but don't do that again. I say, you don't own me. So I chew some more gum, I throw it on the sidewalk. And he says, sir, if you do that again, I'll have to give you a ticket. So I chew some more gum, I throw it on the sidewalk right in front of his feet. And he says, okay, I'm writing you a ticket. So I give him the ticket. I take it from him. I say, I don't believe in your law. And I tear up the ticket, right? He says, that's actually illegal. You can't tear up your ticket, and I'm going to have to arrest you. And you said, I'd like to see you try. So he goes to arrest me. And I start, grappling with him. Eventually, he's going to pull his gun out and say, you're under arrest, go to jail. And if I resist, he might shoot me. All over me flouting a really tiny law. Now, you might say, well, that's not really plausible. Well, no, actually it is. If you guys remember back to the Eric Garner case, I think it was 2016. Eric Garner was a black man who I think it was in either New Jersey or New York City. He was selling cigarettes individually, which is strictly speaking illegal. All right. So, but the cops said, okay, that's illegal. And they got into this altercation and eventually put him in a chokehold and he died. So the point here is that even little laws will eventually provoke force, violence from the state, which is why we should be very hesitant to create even any laws at all. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have any laws. I'm just saying that should motivate us to be very conservative about how we sort of create laws and impose our wills onto other people who may disagree with it. Right? So the principle here, just in general, that more laws will equal more force. Okay. So where does that leave us? What is the ideal Christian approach to social justice? Well, I don't know. This is sort of my point. I think Christians should be agreed on these basic principles, 100%. These are sort of clear principles that are laid out in Scripture, or at least in sort of things like legal compulsion through the threat of force, just from sort of clear reasoning. But where do we draw the line? I think we should have a lot more grace in thinking, in allowing Christians to come to different conclusions about, say, the size of government, or, how much should there be a minimum wage? Should it be $7 an hour? Should it be $15 an hour? The Bible doesn't say that, right? So I think we can allow a lot of freedom for Christians to approach those policy questions in different ways, as long as we're united in affirming these biblical principles to social justice. Okay, now, so I've talked about biblical justice and some basic principles that undergird biblical justice. I've talked about why social justice rooted in critical theory is actually very dangerous. It leads to ultimately unjust laws and unjust ways of thinking that will end up harming people. But I'd like to step back now and ask, well, where does justice even come from then? I mean, we're assuming that justice is a real thing. Do we know that's true? What is justice? What grounds the concept of justice? So first, I'd point out that without morality, there really can't be justice, at least in the sense we understand it. So I could say something like this. I'm going to define justice to mean doing to other people what you would have them do to you. That's defined. That's what justice is. So a just society is one in which the laws force people, or it suggests that people do to others what they would have others do to them. I'm going to call that justice. See, and there, I didn't even use morality. I didn't invoke morality. I didn't invoke anything. This is just a procedure. If you look at their other secular writers like Rawls, who will try to define justice removed from moral considerations, or there were people try to use that framework to talk about justice apart from morality. Here's the problem. I can immediately ask, well, is your understanding of justice good or evil? You've defined justice to be this procedure. Here's how you get justice. And I say, well, is that thing you're calling justice, is it good or is it bad? Should I be just or unjust? Should I avoid injustice? Should I promote justice? Should I protect? Is it good to protect the vulnerable? You'd say, well, you'd want to be protected yourself if you were vulnerable. I could say, but I'm not. Or I could say, yeah, but who cares? I'm not them. I'm not vulnerable right now. And so even if I'd wish they did it to me, I'm an egoist. I do what I feel like. And right now it feels good to trample on the vulnerable. So, or do human rights exist? Is it wrong to violate those rights? Whenever you use the language of justice and injustice, you are assuming a moral framework. Now, why is it important? Well, I'd argue that any kind of moral framework, any kind of justice framework is going to be a problem for an atheistic view of reality, especially a naturalistic view of reality, although I think that it's problematic for both. Let me give you three areas in which an atheistic approach to reality, one that says there is no God, and that will be a problem for someone who wants to promote justice in society. Let me give you three problems. The first is the problem of human value. Imagine I have two wardrobes, and hidden in one wardrobe, there's a human being. But in the other wardrobe, there's a very complex, self-sustaining chemical reaction of DNA, RNA, proteins, and lipids. Now I say, I need you to destroy one of these wardrobes. Take a flamethrower, burn it to the ground, destroy the contents. You pick which one you want to destroy. And you say, well, I got to destroy the chemical reaction. I say, I spent years working on that reaction. You're going to destroy it? Well, man, I just got to do it. So you burn the one wardrobe to the ground. And I say, well, I kind of have to confess, there's a human being in there too. You say, wait, you didn't tell me that. You said it was just a chemical reaction. And I'd say, well, what are human beings, if atheism is true, except complicated chemical reactions? Right? We're just moist robots, or thinking, or complicated computers, or biological computers. What is a human being other than an accidental collocation of atoms, molecules in motion, right? So if we are nothing but the physical stuff then why is there any more value in me than there is in a rock? If I hit a rock with a hammer and smash it to pieces, you're like, oh, too bad for the rock. If I hit a human being in the head with a hammer and break him to pieces, I go to jail. Why? Why are some configurations of matter valuable in a moral sense and others are not? That's a problem. But of course, if we're made in God's image, that's why we have value. We reflect the infinitely good creator of the universe who grounds all value. And that's why we have value, because we reflect God's goodness. We're made in his image. And so we're valuable in ways that rocks or even animals are not. Second, the problem of meaning. A lot of people, especially on college campuses, they are very passionate about social justice. They protest things they see as unjust. But here's the problem. Why do you think that justice or injustice or flourishing or happiness or sadness, any of these things has meaning? Why do you get so worked up about these things as if they meant anything in the long run? Here's Bertrand Russell, the famous atheist. He wrote, "Man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves, his beliefs are the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. Nothing will survive the vast death of the solar system, and the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. Only with the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's salvation henceforth be built." Now, wait a minute. He says, look, it's all meaningless. It's all going to burn up or die or vanish in the end. Nothing you do matters at all. Nothing anybody does matters. In the end, there's no ultimate purpose or meaning in the universe. It's all going to be at an end in oblivion. So then why does it matter whether you're good or bad? Why does it matter whether you care about justice? You say, well, I care about it now. Well, yeah, or now for the next 60 years before you die, and then you're dead. And in 100 years, no one will remember anything. And in a million years, or say a billion years, the sun will turn into a red dwarf, I guess, and the whole earth will be destroyed. And in a trillion years, the whole universe will be empty. So what's the point? Why do you care so much? Well, I don't know. Older atheists were like, that's a good point. Maybe we should commit suicide. They weren't like these happy-go-lucky, yeah, let's fight for justice. They're like, what's the point for anything? Forget justice and injustice. What's the point of even living? That's a valid question. Of course, if God exists, then there is meaning in the universe. The universe is part of a grand drama. And to quote Russell Crowe in the movie Gladiator, the things we do in this life echo in eternity. That's literally true. The good that we do, the evil that we do has eternal consequences. That's why these things matter. That's why there's meaning in suffering. There's meaning in justice. There's meaning in all these issues. But if you believe in an atheistic universe where we all die, we all rot, and eventually everything dies, where is the meaning? What's the point? And finally, the problem of moral criticism. So people today are very passionate about things like women's rights. And you'll see a lot of people saying, women's rights are human rights. We should care about the oppression of women around the world and even here in this country. And here's the question I'd ask, though. If you go to, say, Afghanistan, there are many women there who say, no, actually, I accept my role in the social order. I believe that men are more valuable than me. I accept my role in the social hierarchy. So here's my question. How dare you impose your 21st century, white, European, Western, educated, middle-class moral values onto this Muslim, Eastern, traditionalist system? How dare you? What gives you that right to impose your values on their values? And you say, well, my values are right. Wait a minute. Whoa, wait, your values are right. Where does that come from? What you're appealing to is some transcendent standard of justice and right and wrong and good and evil that all cultures are subject to. You're saying, well, my values are more in alignment with these transcendent values than this other culture's values. And if you don't believe that, then you can't criticize them. They have their own values. Leave them alone. So in the very act of protesting against injustice in other cultures, you are assuming a transcendent standard of justice and good and evil and right and wrong. But if you're an atheist, what in the world are you appealing to? Christians and Jews and Muslims and really all theists can appeal to God's standards, as the standards by which all of our cultures and all of our lives will be judged. But again, can atheists do that? Hard. Okay. But now, lastly, I want to point out that Christianity has a sort of unique take on this idea of justice. So in the last slide, I mentioned that, Jews and Muslims and really anyone who believes in a good and holy and perfect God can appeal to God's standards and God's moral values as the ultimate moral values, and that we have to conform our lives to. They can do that. And therefore, in some sense, all, Muslims, Jews, atheists of any kind can work to achieve justice based on those ideals, those values. And of course, atheists can do that too. I just think that I'm the ground for doing that, but they can also recognize love and compassion as good things. Freedom is a good thing that we should work for. But here I'm point out that Christianity is unique, not in urging you to work for justice, because lots of atheists do that. Lots of Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims and Jews do that. Lots of people do that. So I'm not talking about working for justice. I'm talking about how we think about justice, and especially with relation to who we are, our identity. So Jesus told an interesting story in Luke 18. It's known as the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee and tax collector. So let me give you some background. The Pharisees were very devout, religious, and pious Jewish people. So they were very concerned with keeping all of God's laws, all of them, and living devoutly, praying regularly, fasting regularly. So they were like super duper religious people in Jesus' day, and they were respected by the people because of that. On the other hand, the tax collectors were despised. So at the time, the Romans had conquered Israel and were oppressing them. They were exacting taxes from the Jewish people, and obviously the Jews resented that. However, the tax collectors were Jewish people who had betrayed their nation and collaborated with the Romans to extort taxes from their own people. So obviously they were viewed as traitors, but what's worse, many tax collectors were incredibly greedy and unscrupulous. So not only would they take taxes from their people, they would take more than they were allowed to and give some to Rome and keep the rest for themselves. So they were stealing, they were extorting, they were betraying their people. And because of that, they were viewed as subhuman. They were despised. So on the one hand, you have this respected religious person, the Pharisee, and you have this utterly despised and immoral tax collector. Now, Jesus says, one day they both went up to the temple to pray. The Pharisee goes in front and stands up, and he stands at the front of the temple, and he begins to pray about himself. He says, God, I thank you that I'm not a murderer, I'm not an adulterer, I'm not a robber. I fast twice a week to show his loyalty to God, and I give a tenth of what I get. He's generous. He gives 10% of his income to the temple, which then often would support the poor. So he's religious, and he is doing social justice in the sense they would do it in the first century Palestine. He says, I thank you that I'm not a robber, an evildoer, an adulterer, or even I'm not like this tax collector. He points to the guy in the back. He says, I'm not like him. This guy's scum. And Jesus says, on the other hand, the tax collector wouldn't even look up to God, but he beat his breast. It's an expression of remorse and severe repentance. And he says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, here comes the shock. Jesus says, the tax collector went home justified, declared not guilty, declared righteous before God. And the implication is the Pharisee did not. So God's declaring the unjust, immoral tax collector to be just and moral, and he's declaring the just and moral Pharisee to be immoral and under his wrath. And Jesus' hearers must have been shocked by that, and we're shocked today. Now, put it in our terms. Imagine, if we all have the bad guys, right? If you're a liberal, the good guys are the activists, people, social workers, people working for justice, and the bad guys are the racists, the bigots, these hedge fund managers who just are greedy. They're the bad, and you're saying the bad guy, just because he kind of, he repents and asks God for, he goes home declared righteous, and the good guy, the social worker, the justice worker, he goes home condemned? That's not fair. Or if you're a conservative, the religious guy, the Bible believing Christian, goes home condemned, and this immoral, this crazy progressive, just because he says sorry, he goes home justified. How does that work, Jesus? That makes no sense. I'll tell you why it makes no sense. Because all of us think that we're on the good side. We're one of the good ones. We're not perfect. I'm not saying we're perfect, but we're on the good side. The other bad people, they're on the bad side. They deserve to be condemned. We don't deserve to be condemned. We're not perfect, but I'm just saying I'm pretty good. They're just people like me, and they're unjust people, like him. Here's the problem. It's not what Christianity teaches. Christianity does have a line. There's a line. There's just people and there are unjust people. Here's the problem. We're all down here. We are all unjust. And there's one just person, that's Jesus. There's one person who in the history of humanity ever kept all of God's laws, all of God's rules. He loved his neighbor as himself. And the rest of us are all, in God's eyes, unjust lawbreakers. You say, well, that's kind of extreme. I mean, I'm not that bad, right? I mean, now think about that. You say, have you kept all your moral obligations? You mean you've loved your neighbor as yourself every single second of the day? You say, well, hey, mostly. What is that? Imagine you go to court one day, you're accused of murder, and the judge says, do you commit murder? And you say, well, mostly I don't. He says, you mean mostly you don't? I say, mostly I don't murder. I mean, once in a while, I guess. He says, well, are you going to let me off now? No, I'm not going to let you off. What are you talking about? That's not how the law works. The wages of murder is condemnation, is jail time, is capital punishment. And God says the wages of sin is death. Death in this life, but also eternal judgment in hell. So in God's eyes, all of us, the good people and the bad people are all bad people. And that's why we need to put our trust in the one good person who offers to rescue us. None of us have kept God's laws, which is why all of us need radical grace. But Jesus offers it. He says, on the cross, I took your punishment. I took your place so that you could have my perfect record. You could be declared, like the tax collector, you, though you are unjust, could be declared just and by God because of what I did for you on the cross. I died on the cross. I rose from the dead so that you could be justified before a holy God. So now, what is the implication then for us as for Christians? Number one, that obliterates any boasting. When you look at people, the other people, the bad people, you can't despise them. Why? Because you are in your natural state, you are no different. They're not the bad people. They're like you. You're the bad people. And you're simply a bad person who's been forgiven and regenerated by God. That's the only difference. It's not in you. It's in God's mercy. So we look at cancel culture. We look at the social justice movement. It's often so bitter and angry and self-righteous. And Christians, if they know the gospel, should be the opposite. We should be gentle and humble and lowly and willing to show grace because we've been shown grace. And then second of all, if we've been shown grace and mercy, then we ought to go out showing grace and mercy to others, and also then obeying God's commands out of gratitude. And what are God's commands? He commands us to love our neighbors ourselves. He commands us to love our children, to care for them, to be honest and faithful and genuine, compassionate, and also to work for justice. But that working for justice is an outflowing of our forgiveness. It's because we've been forgiven that we then go out and try to change unjust things in the world. But we don't do it to earn God's favor. We don't do it as a substitute for knowing God. We do it because we know God. So that's, again, a major difference between not just Christianity and atheism or secularism, but between Christianity and all other religions, because Christians believe that there's nothing that we've done, nothing that earns God's favor. But because we've received God's favor as a gift, therefore we go and do what he asks in obedience. So thank you guys a lot for listening to this talk. I'm going to give you one recommendation for reading material I think is excellent. It's Thaddeus Williams' book, Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. Excellent book. Came out like a few months ago. I actually contributed an essay to the book, a very short essay on critical theory, but it deals with all these questions of, the nature of justice, empirical data on how we should think about issues like race and gender and things like that. It's a really clear, accessible, compelling read. So I'd recommend that. The foreword is by John Perkins, the civil rights leader. So yeah, highly recommended. So thank you to my wife, Christina, who is a doctor who supports all of my sort of miserable reading that I do on this subject. My collaborator, Dr. Pat Sawyer, has a PhD in education and cultural studies. We've written a number of articles on this subject at the Gospel Coalition, Icon, Ratio Christi. If you go to my website, shenvyapologetics.com/defend19, don't ask me why it's that. It's kind of an old URL, but defend19. This talk, the slides are available on my website. But the best way to stay in touch with me is via Twitter. I tweet way too much, but my handle is @Neil Shenvy and Pat is @RealPatSawyer. But yeah, you can follow my writings and my speaking stuff that I do. I'll post it on Twitter pretty often. So thank you for your time, and I think I'm doing Q&A now, so I will stop the screen share and look at the Q&A. All right, why don't you, Ethan, why don't you go ahead and ask me questions?
Great. All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So we've got a decent number of questions here, just as a heads up.
Yeah.
So one of the first ones, so you're saying that only Christians can be just? How can you say that when Christians are responsible for most of the evils of Western civilization, including slavery, oppression of the poor, and the patriarchy?
Yeah, so I'm not saying only Christians can be just. I said that you only have a ground for justice. What does justice mean? It's only makes sense. There's only a ground available for justice if you believe that Christianity, or really Judaism or Islam or some monotheistic religion that believes in God exists. So, for example, I would say atheists can do just things. They can do good things, compassionate things, but they don't have an explanation for what justice or morality is. What is it referring to? So that's the difference. I'm not at all saying that only Christians can be just. Now, I would caveat that by saying no one can be just. That's the whole point of the gospel. No one is just. Not Christians, not non-Christians. All of us, in the end, ultimately, are sinners in need of a savior. So I'm not saying, well, are you still saying Christians are better than me? Well, not naturally, no. We're in my natural state, I'm, as Paul says, the worst of sinners. That the gospel says that you are a forgiven sinner and that anyone can have that. The last thing I'd say is that you say, well, aren't Christians responsible for all the evils of Western civilization? Well, I'd say no. Most Romans were not Christians. So Western civilization is a lot bigger than Christianity. But, for a long time, most Western people were Christians, just like most Indian people were Hindus and most Arab people were Muslims. But okay, so are we going to lay the blame for all the injustices of the Arabian empires and Indian empires at the feet of Hindus and Muslims? Well, no. I mean, it's like saying, how do you account for the fact that so many all the black people in Africa were guilty of all the crimes done by Africans? I'm like, well, because that's where for most of history most black people lived. It's a weird connection. So sure, I fully accept the charge that people did terrible things in the name of Christ, even who were professing Christians. I don't deny that. But one, doesn't tell us that Christianity is true or false. And number two, that's sort of true of every civilization, every empire, every group of people, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, right? I mean, I don't lay the blame for the horrors of communist China at the feet of atheism writ large. Like, well, how do you explain that all these people were atheists? Explicitly, the atheist regime. Well, one, doesn't show whether atheism is true or false. And two, I hardly going to blame, say, an atheist in the U.S. for what Mao did 60 years ago. That answers your question. But yeah, just to be clear, I'm not saying atheists cannot be just. I'm saying that they cannot ground the concept of justice. They can't explain what it refers to in reality.
Okay. Would you also consider forced equity as a response to social disparities as a core piece of critical theory?
It's complicated. I wouldn't say it's a core piece. They would say that they define social justice as the elimination of these social hierarchies. And so in modern terms, yes, they would say that equity is social justice is achieved when equity happens, meaning the equal distribution of power between these various groups. And so, yeah, in contemporary discussions, they would want to see equity, meaning, and it's complicated here, but basically meaning equal outcomes between groups. That is sort of a goal. I wouldn't say that is a core tenet of contemporary critical theory. I'd say it's an outworking of these assumptions. If you believe that the social justice is, the breaking down of hierarchies, and the breaking out of hierarchies depends on equity, then yes, you're ultimately going for equity, which they define in a complicated way as equal outcomes. But yeah, I wouldn't. It's these core tenets I'm listing aren't really laid out. They're not like a 10 commandments of critical social theory anywhere. If you read the literature, it's very obvious that they're saying these things, but they're not going to make like a list most times. But again, it's so apparent. I mean, you will find lists of things like the core tenets of critical race theory, and you'll notice they're very similar, although they're focused on race. But you will see the overlap. And so you take what I'm saying as a summary of what they're teaching, not necessarily like an explicit list anywhere.
You have a compliment here saying nice beard.
All right. Yeah. It's about 2 months old. No, 3 months old.
Nice.
That's it? Nice beard. All right. Well, sure.
Okay. This says, great talk. Thank you. What is the most important policy needed today in order to make society more just, and why? And then similarly, what is the most important policy that is currently existing that needs to be removed because it makes society less just, and why?
Yeah, that's a good question, but it's not one I even thought about. And I try to sort of stay in my lane. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand critical theory, critical race theory, critical social theory, and reading these authors. And I've read some, I've read both. So I read a lot of progressive authors, obviously. And I've also read conservative authors like Thomas Sowell. Carl Truman's, he's a historian, but I've read comparatively little on policy. And I always tell Christians this: I'm not here to tell you what laws we should pass. I have my own opinions on that, but I am not remotely qualified to talk about those issues. And I think, again, here's where Christians should extend grace and hear both sides. But what I'm here to say is that the philosophical underpinnings of critical theory are what's poisonous. So, a Christian could walk away from this talk and still be very liberal on things like the minimum wage or immigration, right? They could walk away saying, well, I came in thinking we should have a $30 minimum wage, and I'm leaving the same way. Yeah, of course you can, because I didn't say anything about the minimum wage. But what I hope they're convinced of is, but these ideas have to be rejected by all Christians because they just don't. And I've given other talks where I showed that they're incompatible with just the way with basic Christian doctrine. I can give you some policies that I just think are worth looking into. I'm not saying we should change these things. I am not a policy analyst. I'm not an economist. So take it with a huge grain of salt. I do think that things like criminal justice reform are worth looking into. I am troubled by, things like police brutality. Be careful here. I'm not saying that I think the popular narratives about how rampant corruption are true, but I'm saying there are enough things that give me that are concerning that I would say I would want to look into that. Education is another huge one. I think our school systems are failing for a number of reasons. I don't have an answer, though. And this is where I beg Christians, read both sides. It drives me crazy when I meet Christians who haven't read anything. That's worse, but almost as bad as people who've only read one side's arguments. My goodness, what does Proverbs say? The one who states his case first seems right until another comes and examines him. Proverbs 18:17, I think. Don't do that. Goodness, please read conservatives. Please read liberals, please read libertarians, please read centrists. Before you make any conclusions, do not just accept any side's narrative as the gospel truth. That's just, so again, I'm not making any policy suggestions tonight, and I rarely do, but except to say this: you had better be conversant with the other side's best arguments. And I try to do that. I try to be able to, I want to be able to present the best arguments in favor of all of these things that I think ultimately are very dangerous and wrong. And again, this is a short talk, but in the other talks I give, I do that. I say, here are the positives of critical theory before I critique it. That's really a lost art today. It's sad.
Thanks. Okay. Isn't critical race theory just a conspiracy theory made up by white evangelicals? I've never heard of CRT before tonight, and neither have any of the people I've met at Black Lives Matter rallies.
Okay, so you're lucky that I don't have a good bookshelf, or my bookshelves are all full, because I just want to, this is a 600-page anthology, 500-page anthology. You'll see all the highlighting, but this is one. You are in for a treat tonight, my friend. Let me just pull through all this. But I have a whole stack of books here. They're all the bottoms. But this is the one I quoted from Readings for Diversity and Social Justice. I'm going to find out one with critical race as a title. 1 second. I do have like a huge amount of stacks of stuff here. Here's Beyond Critique, and I'll open up the chapter. If you can see this, this says critical race theory in education. Right. So and you can Google it. Google critical race theory, and it's not a conspiracy theory. It's a very prominent field of it started in the legal discipline and it spread into education. Ladson, Billings, and Tate wrote a very famous paper in 1995 about critical race theory in education. But no, it's not a conspiracy theory. Now, you might be saying, is it being blown out of proportion? Ooh, sorry. So now you made me upset my whole stack of books. You might claim that it's being blown out of proportion by evangelicals. I mean, you can say that. I think you'd have to. You can look at my website. On my website, I've reviewed a ton of critical race theory books and books by evangelical Christians, and I show not only how evangelicals are borrowing the language and ideas of critical race theory, they are citing critical race theorists, and sometimes they're even saying we're citing critical theorists studying race. So now you might think, I think what's more common is that a lot of people believe the ideas of critical race theory are actually true. They think they're good ideas. The conflict is not over whether it exists. It does exist. Or the conflict is really over whether it's true, because I think some people think, no, critical race theory is just true. It's just common sense, or it's just a careful reflection on race and racism in this country. It just is. And so when you portray it as a threat to the gospel, that's a conspiracy theory. Well, I would just say here, well, this is where we maybe disagree. I do think that its fundamental principles are opposed to the proper Christian approach to things like race and many other issues. And if you want to look at my talk, I did a good interview with Pastor Mike Winger. It's on YouTube. Pastor Mike Winger. We did like a 2-hour interview on critical race theory. What's interesting is we spent, at his request, he was very wise about this. At his request, we spent the first half an hour talking about race and racism in the U.S. throughout history, the horrific history of lynching and slavery we have, of racial discrimination today, for a half an hour without talking about critical race theory even one time. And he was right. He wanted to show people it's possible to have these conversations without invoking any of the categories of critical race theory, and in fact, even rejecting them wholeheartedly. So after we did that, then we went on and talked about, now, wait a minute. So you can have this conversation with no critical race theory at all. So then what's the problem then with critical race theory? Well, here are the problems. So we go through for an hour and a half that remained. We talked about the dangers of its core ideas. And this is what I emphasize. I'm not saying that everything critical race theory says is false. I'm not saying that. There are some things that it affirms that are true and even insightful. However, its core tenets, which you can find in books like Crenshaw's or Delgado's or Yasso's article, Whose Culture Has Capital, its core tenets, I would argue, are in sort of fundamental ways dangerous and ultimately opposed to the right way to think about things like race and racism. So yeah, we can talk about it more now, but I would just refer you to that interview, which might be helpful. I also did a debate with Rasul Berry on the radio program Unbelievable on, is critical race theory compatible with Christianity? He says yes, and I say no. So you can listen to that debate and listen to our arguments and decide for yourself who's presenting the better arguments for their position. So that might help.
Okay. To what extent should we be concerned that we cannot put the biblical view of virtue and flourishing into conversation with the secular view of virtue and flourishing? Given that a person who has bought into a broadly secular view of justice and flourishing will have a coherent ideology that meshes with their preferences and values, is there any chance of finding enough common ground between paradigms to talk a person out of a secular view of justice/human flourishing? How might a rational person with a Christian view of justice/flourishing talk someone out of a broadly secular view, or convince the person with the secular view that they are viewing things the wrong way?
Sure, this is a great question because, and this is actually, it's a tricky question because what I and many other people are seeing more and more is that what's called a critical social justice or critical theory, however you want to refer to it, but it is functioning as a religion. It has these deep faith commitments. Actually, if you read a book, another book I'll pull up over here, it's a book, Cynical Theories by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose. They're both atheists, but they are both concerned, deeply concerned with the inroads that critical social justice is making in government, in education, in our culture. And in this book, they sort of highlight some of the real problems with ideologically, as atheists, the problems that critical social justice has with coherence, with ultimately with corresponding to reality. And that's what I, so, but they themselves say, I should pull up a quote here, but they compare repeatedly critical social justice to a religion, and which is why it's so hard to dislodge, because again, you're dealing with assumptions, not conclusions, not evidence-based, but assumptions that are going to be brought into any conversation. So it can be very hard to dislodge those basic presuppositions. I think a couple of things you can do. One is you can show them that they're inconsistent. So for example, critical theory will often problematize the idea of hegemonic power, imposing your narrative on culture. That's oppressive, right? Well, as critical social justice becomes more and more prominent in our culture, well, it's imposing its narrative onto us. So it's oppressive. So that's a deep conflict there. Now they have answers for that. They'll say, well, their narrative is liberatory. Like, it's very ad hoc. But just point out that, look, I don't believe that. I'm a Christian. I don't believe in your narrative. And so you're actually oppressing me when you make me go to these different, diversity trainings or whatever. And they're, at least if they're based on critical theory. So that's one point. You can point out they're internally inconsistent. Another thing you can do is you can point out they don't correspond to reality. So one example would be that critical theory tends to view all disparities as the result of discrimination. If you see a disparity, racial disparity, sex disparity, any kind of disparity, it is the result of discrimination, and it's a lack of equity. And for instance, Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist, explicitly says that if you don't believe that all racial disparities are solely the result of discrimination, if you don't believe that, you are racist. Now, that makes literally no sense, because you can find example after example of racial groups and ethnic groups that there are these huge disparities in their favor relative to white Americans, but no one thinks that, for example, Indian Americans, their median income is like $106,000 a year. The median white household in America, is $60,000 a year. So Indian Americans make a huge amount more than white Americans in terms of median household income. But no sane person believes that that's because Indian Americans are being discriminated in favor of them. Like we have this terrible pro-Indian discrimination in our laws. No, that's not it at all. And Thomas Sowell, who's a Black economist, gives example after example where this claim is just completely obviously false. And the hard part is that when you bring that up, people will often, it's an assumption. They're like, I know why you're saying that. It's because you're racist. And you're like, no, I'm just pointing out this is not factual. And really, and then the third thing you can point out, which I think it's hard when people are going to say, you only say that because you're racist. It's like, well, okay, that's an ad hominem, but here's one thing I'm going to point out. If you don't base your policy on reality, you will hurt people. An example would be this is just, again, 5 years ago, it would have been shocking, but there are multiple discussions right now that would, there's racial disparities between whites and blacks and Hispanics and Asians in terms of test scores. So you'd say, okay, well, now normally the normal sort of classical liberal response would be, how can we improve the test scores of, say, blacks and Hispanics who tend to score lower, and frankly, Asians score higher than whites. And so, but how can we invest in these underprivileged communities to boost the test scores? That's a classical liberal response, right? Under the influence of critical theory, there are multiple school districts that are now suggesting just getting rid of the tests, because the tests must be biased because they're producing biased outcomes. They're producing disparities in test scores. So get rid of the tests. They must be discriminatory. And you're like, is that going to help anyone? That's insane. You're going to hurt the very people you're trying to help. And actually, in Thomas Sowell's book, Discrimination and Disparities, points out how often these policies are based on ideology, not on actually helping people. And because of that, they end up, not always, but often hurting the very people they're intending to help. So maybe the final point you can make is that even if your intentions are good, you genuinely believe you're working for justice, if your ideas are not rooted in reality and in empirical evidence, they can easily end up hurting people, especially those you're trying to help. So sometimes I think people are often, charitably, they're motivated by good desires, but they've imbibed this very wrong ideology. And that is going to, if I really want to cure a sick person, and I truly, with all my heart, believe that the way to do that is to, bleed them and to apply leeches, they're not going to get better. They might die. And it doesn't matter how sincere I am. I might sincerely believe I'm doing the best for them, but I'm not. In the same way, if I sincerely believe these ideas are going to help people, but they don't, in reality, I'm going to hurt people. So you can find examples of this people pointing out these policies are counterproductive and even dangerous in all kinds. I mean, there are classical liberals, there are libertarians, there are conservatives, all pointing out that these policies grounded in critical theory are hurting real people. There are plenty of examples I can point you to. And if you look at my website, and I've reviewed a ton of books that will point some of these examples out. But that might be an inroad, because if they're really motivated by a desire to help people, then the suggestion that you might be actually be hurting people ought to carry weight. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't always, because it's so powerful to feel like you're a good person, right? To feel like I know I'm helping people. Don't take that away from me. That can be more powerful than actually suggesting, well, no, but here's the better way to do it. So that's why it's so has such a great hold on people, because it's giving them a sense of righteousness. Sorry, long answer.
Thank you. Okay, so how do you reconcile the biblical content concerning slavery, i.e., an example would be Exodus 21:21 that says no punishment should be given for injuring a slave, or New Testament content telling slaves to submit to their masters?
Sure, there's a lot written on these topics. I'm going to recommend a really good talk by, I think it's Peter Williams, who's the warden of Tyndall House. He compares Hebrew slavery, ancient Near East slavery, and Greco-Roman slavery to chattel slavery in the U.S. What I would simply point out is that in both the Old and New Testaments, kidnapping of people into slavery was punishable by the death penalty, instant death. And chattel slavery in this country was predicated on kidnapping, that, Africans kidnapped other Africans or captured them in war and then sold them into bondage to slave traders, European slave traders, who then took them. I mean, some slave traders kidnapped the people themselves. But actually, if you look back at the historical record, everybody knew that slave trader was absolutely terrible. Like even people supporting slavery back then were like, slave trading is terrible. So they knew at some level, even the pro-slavery people knew that the entire system was punishable by death. If anyone had obeyed the biblical prohibitions on man stealing, as we called in the King James Version, chattel slavery would not have even existed, period. And because of the New Testament's injunctions to treat slaves, which again, this Greco-Roman slavery was indeed different than what we had in the US. So the words are the same, they're used the same, but a lot of scholars will say it's really not really, it's misleading to translate the New Testament word slave as slave. So we think of chattel slavery, but the New Testament letters, they insist that masters must treat their slaves as brothers. And in Philemon, Paul even says, when there's a slave who runs away from his master and steals his master's stuff, he sends the slave back and tells the owner, you know what you ought to do. You ought to receive him like you receive me, the apostle. And you look at even very conservative Christians who I think are wrong about, they think, oh, slavery in this country wasn't so bad. I think they're wrong, by the way. But even those people will say, based on that letter, Onesimus, the slave, was freed. Like Paul's saying in that letter, the right thing to do is to free your slave. And based on that ethic that we ought to love everybody as ourselves, you look at the slave system, and this is what Christians realized, by the way. This is why the abolition movement started. Christians began saying, this is horrific. You're a Christian and you're going to take a child away from his parents and sell him? That's disgusting. You're going to kidnap a whole millions of people, kidnap them, take them out of their homeland and bring them here and beat them and rape them. No, this is horrific. And so that is why, again, the abolition movement was driven not entirely, but largely by Christians who said this is completely incompatible with Christianity. And again, you look at their literature, they're not these theological liberals. They're appealing to scripture and saying, no, Paul commands Onesimus to be freed. This is no way compatible with the love ethic. So again, the question is, why didn't God just give us command, thou shalt not keep slaves? I mean, he did say, literally, man-stealing is a capital offense and is incompatible with the gospel. So against in 1 Timothy 1 or maybe in Titus. But why didn't he just say, but any kind of servitude at all is forbidden? And I think the answer, it's not to me. I mean, I would have preferred him to say that. I'll admit it. I mean, I didn't write the Bible. This is one reason I know that if I were to write the Bible, there are things I'd take out, there are things I'd put in. And that's one of the reasons I know that I didn't just make up the God of the Bible, right? If you make up your own God, you kind of Build-A-Bear God, you make him perfect. You make him exactly perfect in your eyes. You make him look just like you. But there are things in the Bible that I don't naturally like, that I simply have to trust and submit to. And this is one of them. But I think but the answer, I think, is that God did command that even slavery back then, which was different, were to treat the servants, that's where bond servants is often a translation, the Christian were to treat them as brothers. And that ethic did actually dismantle slavery in the entire world eventually. If you look at, again, Thomas Sowell, Black scholar who's written on slavery extensively, he says what's not remarkable is slavery, because slavery has existed in every single culture for all of human history. What's astounding is that anyone said slavery is wrong. Now, why did that happen? And it's because Western civilization, and Europeans in particular, were so motivated by Christian love ethic. They realized, and also, to give credit where it's due, this vision of individual human rights and liberty, that they were moved to say this is an abomination. And then they went and dismantled slavery wherever they found it. And you can actually, in his books, he'll talk about how the British Empire, not only did they get rid of slavery, they stamped it out in their colonies when the people were unwilling to do it. So then the people in, say, in Arab world and in African countries were often wanted to keep slavery because it was profitable. And the British colonial empire was like, no, you may not do slave trading here, not on our watch. Now, I'm not saying colonialism was good. I'm just saying that Sowell asks, in hindsight, we're asking the wrong question. We're saying, gosh, why did it take them so long to figure it out? And he's like, why did they ever figure it out? Because it's never happened in history for thousands of years. So it's probably not satisfactory. I would, again, recommend you read or watch Peter Williams talk. I don't think who else has written on this subject. I can get back to you on this for other resources, but I do think there are other answers. Are they going to satisfy you? They may not. This is the shocking thing to hear. I know that when I was not a Christian, I wanted to have answers for everything. I wanted God to be exactly what I wanted God to be. And it took me a while to realize a God who is exactly what I want is not real. That's an imaginary that's an imaginary friend. The God who's real is going to challenge me in ways that that doesn't make any sense, but he's real. And so we have to submit to what he says if he's real. And then the question then is only, is he real and true? Not do I like him? And so to make it very clear, I'm not saying that chattel slavery is fine. No, it's an abomination. It's horrific. Do I wish God had been clearer on that? I wish, yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, I wish God had been like, P.S. in Romans, in 2,000 years, in 1,600 years, the Americans are going to create chattel slavery in the U.S., and that's evil. And, sign Paul. I would have loved that, but it's not there. Instead, God gave us an ethic that in the end dismantled slavery, not just in the U.S., but all over the world, because people realize you can't treat people this way. They're made in God's image, and they're brothers in Christ. So that's the long answer, I guess.
Great, thank you. You suggest a libertarian view of government that all laws are built on a threat of force, i.e. Big Brother. How might this view of government be tempered by Romans 13, which also describes authority as God's minister to you for good? As Christians, can we support government's positive role in correcting oppression or upholding justice?
Yeah, so I was just adding that as a consideration. I didn't say, I am a libertarian. I'm not. I'm a conservative. So I do think this idea that, so I think it's true that all laws are executed via threat of force. I believe that. It's true, right? But sometimes threat of force is justified and good. Like, I want police with guns enforcing the law not to murder. I want them to have that power. But my only point is that we say, okay, well, if that's good, maybe they should also make it illegal to, say, commit assault. I'm like, yeah, good. We can use that force to prevent that. Well, how about hate speech? I mean, being, hateful words and hateful speech is sin. Do I really want someone pulling a gun on someone who uses mean words, which I think are a sin? What about mean thoughts? So my only point is, at some point, we should recognize that even if we think an action is immoral, we should be hesitant to, is it immoral enough to require the threat of force? That's my only question we should ask. Sometimes the answer is yes, but conservatives like me should hear the libertarian critique saying, how much are you willing to do to make someone comply at the end of a barrel of a gun? That's the question I have to ask. And sometimes the answer is yes. I want a rapist to be forced not to rape under threat of being shot. I do want that. But I do not want some laws I really feel passionately about enforced under threat of force, because I just don't think that there's a trade. I think this goes back to Aquinas. There's a trade-off between the disorder introduced by laws, by sin, and sort of the disorder introduced by having excessive laws. You have to balance those two concerns, right? We don't want, and actually, here's the interesting thing too, I'll add, as a Baptist, traditionally, Baptists were very big on freedom of conscience for historical reasons. And I would add, just empirically, the gospel flourishes when there is the most freedom of conscience. So that's just an empirical historical fact. We actually I heard a talk from a international advocate for religious liberty who was a Christian. And she said that, my organization advocates for religious liberty for all people, Jews, Muslims, Hindu, and this is international. But they advocate for religious freedom for anybody under threat. And she said, sometimes people ask, well, why would you defend some Baal worshippers like to worship Baal? That's wrong. And she says, yeah. And she says, okay, I kind of get what you're saying, but religious freedom, when there is religious freedom, is when Christianity flourishes, because the gospel can hold its own against other religions. But the gospel, if you're crushing it under the boot of religious oppression of any kind, it doesn't flourish. So pragmatically, even, I would say, I want liberty and freedom. Those are values to me, and partly because I do think that the gospel flourishes when it's given freedom, when there's freedom in the society. Now, that's not complete freedom. I'm not an anarchist or libertarian, but I think that is a positive value, I think.
Great. Okay, so this is a comment, but I'd like to see how you respond to it, and then I'll kind of turn it into a question a little bit. Says, I don't care how you define justice when I see all of the ways Black people are statistically disadvantaged. You as a white person just need to listen more to the stories of Black people. So my question is, what do you see the role of personal testimony in when you're forming your opinions?
Okay, so let me just say this, because I have to say it oftentimes. I'm not actually white. I get that a lot, but I am half Indian. I have the beard would do it. I mean, come on, guys. This is a luxurious beard. It was longer before I trimmed it. Anyway, whatever. Well, I don't care. It's fine. I'm white. My mom's white. My dad's Indian. So this is one of the parts of what's called standpoint epistemology that I think is particularly dangerous, because it would say, the role of oppressors, whether they're whites or men or heterosexuals or the rich, is to shut up and listen. And that's kind of an extreme version of it, but your role is to listen and to defer to the lived experience of the oppressed people. There's a lot, it's a problem there. And in the other talks, I go into this. What am I not saying? I'm not saying we ignore people's experiences or testimonies. That's ridiculous. Of course, I believe in testimony. I believe in the testimony of the gospel writers when they talk about Jesus' resurrection. I believe in people's testimony in court. So I'm not saying if someone says this happened to me, I'm saying, no, you're a liar. No, that's not true. I do respect and value people's individual experiences, their testimony. Absolutely, right? But there are several problems with absolutizing that. In other words, saying, actually the comment was, you need to stop dealing with statistics and start dealing with experiences. Well, that's really, I'll say this gently, it's not coherent. It's not realistic. It's just a problem. So here's a couple of problems. One, people's lived experiences will be contradictory. I can't absolutize all of them. So one person will say, I'm a black man and I've been harassed all the time by police, right? But I've talked to a black friend of mine who lives in South Carolina. She's a black woman, and she's actually, she's like, racism is just not part of my life here. I just don't see it. I don't experience it, and so she just doesn't. Okay. Now, which of those lived experiences should I absolutize? Should I say absolutize the first guy and say, no, racism is everywhere, it's awful, or my friend who's a black woman and say, no, it's nowhere, it doesn't exist? I can't do both. So are they both equally true? Is it there? It's not your truth and mine. No, it's something is true about reality. Okay, that's one thing. Another problem when you say, listen to black voices. Well, whose black voice? This is going to shock you, but a Pew survey, I think it was in, what year was it? It was in the last 30 years, I'm sure of that. But a Pew survey, when they asked non-college educated blacks, has race been an obstacle to your success or failure in life? 29% said it's been an obstacle. So it's hurt them. So the race has hurt them in their successes and failures in life. 29% said it's been a hindrance. I think it was 50% said neither a help nor a hindrance. And then the remainder was like 11% said it's been a help. But the bottom line is that over 2/3 of blacks in this survey, it was a pure survey. It's actually in this book right here, this Williams's book. 2/3 of blacks said that their race was either irrelevant to their success or failure, or it was actually a help to them in their life. 2/3 of non-college educated blacks. So that's their lived experiences. A survey is the best way to get lived experiences in aggregate, right? So when you say listen to lived experiences, well, why not theirs? That's their lived experience. A survey, I think a recent survey in the last year or two, asked blacks, do you want more police presence in your neighborhood or the same or less? And it was 20% wanted less police presence, 60% said the same, and 20% said more. So it was like dead split, with only 20% saying they wanted fewer police. And yet what you hear is, we got to have, reduced policing. It's oppressive policing presence. It's terrible. But equal numbers said we want more, as said we want less. And most said it's fine. Or we want equal amounts. So again, you just can't say lived experience and not surveys. Well, I'm trying to listen to people, but this is what they're saying when you actually do surveys. And then finally, in terms of listening to voices of color, I listen to voices of color. I've read it, but they're not monolithic. There is no monolithic black voice. They're diverse. Where's the white voice? Where's the half Indian voice? There isn't one. We're individuals. So if you listen to Thomas Sowell, the economist I've referenced a long time, Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, they are either on the right or actually McWhorter's a liberal. Lowry's probably center right, maybe, and Sowell's conservative. But they're across the spectrum. They're all black, but they all are really opposed to critical race theory, anti-racism, and this way of thinking. Very opposed. I've also read Kendi, I've read Ta-Nehisi Coates. I've read Cornel West. They're on the other side of the spectrum. They're all on the left. So whose voice should I listen to? So I'm just pointing out when you say things like that. So that's just one big problem. You're not really saying listen to people's lived experience. You're saying listen to this person's lived experience because it accords with my narrative. That's not really fair. Why can't I? Because there are plenty of, I'll be frank here. There are lots of conservatives who are happy to listen to Black voices if it happens to be Thomas Sowell, or if the Black voice happens to be, Larry Elder, or other conservative Black men, right? So, or Candace Owens, right? So we should never listen to the person who confirms our priors, who confirms our biases. We should listen to all people, Black, white, orange, and purple, right? And try to figure out what's true. The last thing I'll just say is this. The minute you start saying, like, we need to just be quiet and listen to people's lived experiences, I point out in my talks, maybe you want to draw the line at race. You say, well, I'm talking about people of color. And let's be honest here, that's me actually. Okay. So really when you're saying I don't know who asked the question, but why don't I count? Whatever. It's fine. I get that I'm racist as white, but eventually I have a funny meme where I have that, it's a picture from The Simpsons where he has a card that says "not insane." I said I one of those that says "not white," but whatever. It's an old show. Anyway, you want to restrict this epistemology to race, but critical theorists don't do that. They want to apply this epistemology, this way of knowing things, not just to race, but to gender, to sexuality, to religion. So once you embrace this idea that, if you're an oppressor, you need to shut up and listen. Sit down, shut up, and just listen and believe what they're telling you. Well, where do you draw the line then? Are you going to believe, say, a Muslim when he says, my lived experience is that Islam is true, or that Christianity is oppressive, it's oppressing me? Or an atheist says, I'm an atheist, my lived experience is that Christians are awful bigots and your religion is false. You say, yes, amen, because I'm listening to your lived experience. What about sexuality? Are you going to just embrace whatever sexual ethic is promoted by a member of an oppressed group because that's their lived experience? They know who they are. They know that your religion is oppressive to them. So it's not a slippery slope. It's the logical implications of this reliance on lived experience. You can't do it. It's going to just ruin your theology. So again, you will not find me anywhere saying ignore people's testimony, ignore their lived experience. You're not going to find me saying don't empathize, don't care about their pain. No, I'm not saying any of that stuff. I'm just saying that at the end of the day, when you try to assess what reality actually is like, you cannot simply rely on lived experience. You have to take into account careful studies, statistics, surveys, philosophical reasoning. You can't dismiss all those things as elements of whiteness.
How would you navigate relationships with friends or family who are pro-social justice, a big issue, something that you would be concerned about?
Yeah, again, I really highly recommend this book. I think it's the best one that I've read ever, really, for gently showing people the problems with this ideology. He's very sensitive to concerns about justice. He's very passionate about justice. And actually, the interesting thing is, talk about voices of color. If you look at the contributors, I am one, and I guess I'm barely qualify as a person of color, but whatever. But there are many contributors who are people of color, and some of them, like Monique Dusson, was fully enthralled within the critical race theory framework. She was a social worker. She talks about how she came out of that sort of ideology in response to prayer and seeking the scriptures and talking to friends about its problems. And so Edward Ramirez, another guy who talks about how he was woke and he realized it was making me bitter and angry, and he was preventing me from fellowshipping with white brothers and sisters. I was resentful towards them. So but I'm pointing out is that their lived experience. If you want to listen to voices of color, well, you have to listen to their voices too. Now, you might think they're wrong. That's fair game. But you can't say that you're open to hearing their stories but not your stories. You don't count. And man, oh man, I got to tell you, Sam Say is one of the guys in here. He talks about how some of the most brutal people, the most cruel people, the most hateful people he encounters are white progressives. And we'll call him the nastiest racial slurs because he's not woke. And you think about it, he's like, no, wait a minute. If you hate racism so much and you're on here calling me these awful racial slurs because I'm not woke, that belies your claim to be anti-racist. So anyway, I'd recommend that book as a great way to build bridges to people that are concerned about they're falling into this ideology. Another way to build bridges would be for you to read a book like Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. I haven't seen the movie and I don't know much about his work outside of the book, but the book itself is very good. It's mainly a memoir. It's moving, it's redemptive. I really enjoyed it. And so if you want to, again, connect to people, one way to do that would be to read people, or even read Ibram Kendi, read Robin DiAngelo, and then so you can have something to talk about with them, and then gently point out, well, here's some problem. If I've read Kendi, would you consider reading someone like John McWhorter, or would you consider reading someone like Glenn Lowry or Thomas Sowell? And we could compare notes. That'd be a way to sort of build bridges again. But I have to confess, it is because, in the words of Pluckrose and Lindsay, because it's functioning as a pseudo religion, or it's a gospel according to social justice, it's hard to dislodge.
Thanks. Okay. In an interview with Mike Winger, you spoke about a survey showing that 1/6 of Americans are morally opposed to interracial marriage, which would seem to suggest that a surprisingly large portion of Americans can be characterized as racist. Does this equate to / naturally result in a society that can be categorized as systemically racist?
Yeah, actually, it's more than 1 in 6. So the survey you're referring to, I believe, was 28% of Republicans thought interracial marriage was morally wrong. And then it was less than, so it's probably on average, maybe you're right, it's on 20% of all whites. So does that equate to systemic racism? Interestingly, that's not how critical race theorists think about systemic racism. So they would not see that really as evidence either way, because they do not define racism in terms of heart, anything, individual, even motive or intention or anything. They would define racism primarily in terms of systems which perpetuate racial disparities and racial hierarchy. And it's so independently of people's heart motives. So let me answer your question first. Do I think that makes America systemically racist? I don't think so. One, it's a minority. And if you actually look at the demographics, that kind of sentiment is literally dying off. So the older people, and kind of obviously older people, tend to have more racially prejudicial or outright racist attitudes. And the younger generations, it's vanishing. And there's just demographics. So, in the next, every time the next generation dies, the percentage drops. And so, you can see this in every survey you look at. Number one. Number two is, even people that have, I think, and now let me be fair here, because people have raised this objection before. When you say, well, I think interracial marriage is morally wrong, you're flatly wrong. And the chances that you're motivated by negative racial stereotypes, I think, are so obvious. I'm going to at least grant, because people complain about this, could be that people are simply mistaken. They don't harbor any ill will at all towards blacks at all. They just think it's wrong for some unspoken reason to marry outside your race. You're straining my credulity, but I'll at least grant there might be one dude out there, or 3 people out there who just happen to be wrong on this issue and are just uninformed about what God says about how all of us are made of one blood, that we should are brothers and sisters in Christ. And so I'll grant that. But yeah, I agree. Frankly, I'm just like, well, no, look, if you are morally opposed to racial marriage, there's racism there. There's enmity or a view of inferiority towards the other race. I just don't see how you can think that plausibly is not the case in most of these cases. That said, I do think it's dying off. I also don't think that, and to also be fair, that was one survey. Other surveys showed lower rates of racial prejudice, various kinds. I don't think it would rise to the level of systemic racism, even on my understanding of, I would say systemic racism, for me, when I define systemic racism, I define it as racial enmity enshrined and codified into law. And largely that does not exist anymore. Like, thank God this country has no more de jure, be careful here, de jure racist laws on the books that were created to harm or minority groups. Those are gone now, unless I'm uninformed. Maybe there are a few out there, but those are gone. De jure, there may exist systems that in practice harm African Americans, not intentionally, but they do actually do that. And I'm open to that too. I think they're often overemphasized. It's about, let me emphasize here, that's not what critical race theorists mean by systemic racism. They mean any law of any kind that perpetuates racial disparities, which is something different. So I don't think that survey data reflects, widespread racial animus, which is again not what CRTs mean. But let me say something that will be controversial though. We have to remember that because racism is for Christians is a sin, and it springs from a heart motivated by partiality and hatred. I saying that there's systemic racism, meaning racial animus in this country, in that sense, is true. Why? Because there's systemic sin in this country. There's all kinds of hatred in this country. So if you survey attitudes towards men and women and whites and blacks and Asians and Hispanics, you'll find all manner of unclean thing living in the human heart. Now, I don't know the percentages. I don't know if there's 50% of people hate, half Indians. I always use me as an example so I don't offend anybody. But I don't know that's the case. But my only point is that we tend to narrowly focus on this one kind of hatred when, my goodness, people hate me just because I understand that hatred because of your race is maybe particularly hurtful because of our history as a country. But man, oh man, people are awful because we're sinners. So I don't think we should have this laser focus on one kind of hatred, as evil as it is, and forget that there are plenty of other kinds to go around. And I think, why is that? Because this is the really tricky and dangerous part. By focusing on one kind of sin, you will often neglect the other kind of sin. C.S. Lewis talked about how sins come in pairs, and Satan's goal is to get us so concerned with one sin that we run away from it into the other kind of sin. So we're so concerned. He gives an example, I think, of we're so concerned with the danger of bigotry, and in his case, he was talking about religious bigotry, being you have to be doctrinally pure or you're a heretic, and we're gonna kill you. We're so terrified of the Inquisition that we run to the other extreme of saying doesn't matter what you believe. We tolerate anything as long as you're loving. And the answer is no. Believing false doctrines is actually sinful. Like believing in that, worshiping idols is a sin for Christians. And yes, it's wrong to kill people who worship idols, at least in the US today. It's illegal and immoral, but it's also still wrong to worship idols. So he's pointing out that when you hyper focus on one sin, you often open yourself up to the opposite sin. Same way I'm saying, if you focus narrowly on racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, which is a problem, you can begin to ignore other sins, and this will be unpopular. There are people that I see daily on social media who could only be characterized as racist against white people. They say things that, if the roles were reversed, would be just horrifically, evilly racist towards whites. And as Sam says, as a Black man, he gets hatred from whites, but from presumably anti-racist whites. So they would not show up on your survey about is interracial marriage immoral, but he's felt it. He's experienced it. So that's the danger of saying, oh, this kind of hatred is really bad. This kind of hatred, we're not going to talk about that really. Man, hatred is a sin. Repent and love your brothers.
Thanks for your talk. Is there any way to find more information about your knowledge of theoretical chemistry and how that informs your religious beliefs?
Okay. So theoretical chemistry is not directly related to anything spiritual. It's cool. It's very interesting. But I have given, there's a YouTube talk I've done. It's called Miracles, Materialism, and Quantum Mechanics. Because my specialty is quantum mechanics. And so I talk about how quantum mechanics does have implications for things like consciousness, free will, miracles, etc. So if you look on YouTube, look for Neil Shenvy, Miracles, Materialism, and Quantum Mechanics. You should be able to find it. If you can't find it, just email me. My email is my website, and I'll help you find it. But it should be on YouTube. And I have a few essays I've written about that topic. It's not a lot. I haven't written a lot about it, but that's most relevant.
Great, thanks. And we can post some references on the Facebook page to some of your work too.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Neil. I follow your work and get excited every time you post something new. My question is this: how do we engage with fellow Christians who have adopted secular social justice, specifically the epistemology of critical theory or ethnic Gnosticism?
Guys, I'm telling you, this is good stuff. The other book I'm reading, and I haven't finished it, so I want to reserve recommending it until I've finished it. I've read half of it. It's a book by Vodi Bakum called Fault Lines. Do I have it? You should see my floor, guys. It's a mess. I'm just reaching around, pulling books up. I don't have it in this room. Vodi Bakum's a Black pastor. He actually lives in Africa right now. I think he's the head of university there. But his book Fault Lines talks about the dangers of critical theory and secular social justice. Again, I'm halfway through. And so I don't want to just say, yeah, it's great because I haven't finished it yet. I like the part I've read so far. There's some things I disagree with him about. If I were you, I would buy it and read it first before you recommend it to anybody. He's very blunt. And so he might not be the best one for building bridges to people that have adopted this. But it might help you see the dangers of, you used his phrase, ethnic Gnosticism. He coined that phrase, so that's why I'm recommending his book. But yeah, it's worth reading, I think, but I don't know that it will be, people will be receptive to it because he is so, I think he's right in many cases, and he's very blunt about it. Williams's book is the irony here is that, you think they would listen to a Black man telling them these things, but this guy's a white guy. But I think this is a much more gentle approach to the issue. He does very clearly say this is bad stuff, but he's going to speak in maybe in a language they'll listen to. But yeah, it's worth, since you used his phrase, it's worth buying his book and reading it. And again, I can't vouch for it. I haven't finished it yet. I just thought I'd mention it. But I'd recommend Williams' book, and it has a lot of voices from other people saying the same thing that Williams is saying.
Okay, so we've got about time for maybe a question or two more. What is the Bible's relationship with equity? Does the Bible prescribe equity as a remedy to social issues? Okay, so briefly, I would say no. And the reason is because equity, I'll just give it very briefly here. Equity is defined as a quality of outcome. Now, I know there's a lot of caveats there, but essentially, functionally, it is a quality of outcome. But the Bible consistently, especially in Proverbs, talks about how hard work will, in the natural ordering of things, hard will pay off and laziness will not. The New Testament is full of examples of Jesus himself telling parables where some people will get lots and are rewarded lots, and some people get less and do nothing with it and are rewarded less. Now, there are other places where there's, sharing resources. There's things like in Acts 2 where the early Christians shared everything, didn't claim any personal possessions of their own. So I'm not saying that the whole story of the Bible is just this free market capitalism. No, I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that there's enough in the Bible that says, look, this idea that we're going to have perfect outcomes, equality of outcome for every single group of everybody, that's just insane. And again, I'd recommend here Sowell's book, Discrimination and Disparities, or Disparity and Discrimination by Thomas Sowell. But he gives those practice examples that are just fascinating of how natural things, chance, fortune, talents, will lead to inequities. And the only way to remedy that is basically through tyranny. One example he gives, this is crazy, but of the first, I forget, the Apollo astronauts, there were 25, I doesn't make this numbers wrong, 25 Apollo astronauts, right? Of the 25 Apollo astronauts, 19 of them were firstborn children.
way more than you'd expect by random chance alone. National merit scholars that are much more likely to be the first child than the fifth child, right? So now why is that? Now his point is, if you see these disparities in children living under the same roof with the same parents, with the same education, with the same access to all these things, you see disparities. What sane person thinks you can have a completely equal outcomes for people that are completely different families, completely different culture, different language groups, different countries? That is insanity. I think it's a very practical, a good point. You cannot achieve equal outcomes. You just can't unless you're willing to just clamp down and crush everyone's differences, which I think is just evil. And there again, there's a simple, obvious example. If you have a two-parent household, right, you are going in every sociological study that's out there that I've ever heard of affirms that if you are living in an intact two-parent biological household, then your life outcomes are going to be better than on average than a person who grew up in a single-parent household. That's just, every study has shown that. The only way to get rid of that disparity is to take people out of their parents' households. That's the only way. How can you keep kids from benefiting from having two parents? Do you even want to? You can't. And actually, to be fair, some communist countries tried that. They tried to take kids away from their parents in order to achieve equity. That, my friends, is just pure evil. Okay, so I don't want to do that. But that's the only way you're going to get rid of, intact family privilege. And so that at the very least, you'd say, the Bible is so emphatic about the goodness of family and children and parents and the roles they play, that at least should tell you that you cannot achieve equity at least with regard to that one topic, without utterly flouting God's design for humanity. And Ethan, I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes when I answer. I don't know how many more questions we have here, but I'm willing to stay, so I don't want to cut people off. I feel bad.
We've made it through about half of them, and there's more coming. So I guess I can keep asking you a few more questions. Okay. Regarding economic justice, and you could probably tie this to race as well, would you say it is a better goal for government to try and prevent poverty before it happens, or letting churches try to help the poor through charity?
Again, policy issues I'm not going to comment on. I will say that, and this is one thing that young Christians especially need to hear. Stop, I'm going to put this bluntly, stop making excuses and punting to the government to do your job. God commands you to seek justice. God commands you to care for the poor. I know if you want to go and wave signs and seek just laws, you are more than happy. You're welcome to. I'm not condemning that, but I'm saying do not sip your $15 Starbucks double triple mocha cappuccino and on your iPhone scrolling Instagram or whatever you do on Instagram. I don't have Instagram yet, but don't do that and then say that you are just because you voted for your preferred candidate. No, my friend, God commands you to do that personally, individually first. Some of the most conservative, rapidly conservative people that I know politically have done the most outrageous acts of personal love and generosity. There's a guy that I know who is super conservative, but he happened to mention that he and his wife, I won't go into it, but he mentioned that he and his wife, and he had kids, he had young kids, they would take homeless people into their house and help them to get a job, to get back on their feet, to get their life together. Many times. I know several people, multiple Christians who would do that. And the two that I'm thinking of who do that I know personally are very conservative. And one of them tells me that when he asks his sort of secular super progressive friends, they're like, yeah, you're a Christian, you're a terrible conservative, evil bigot, whatever. What do you do for the poor? And he just kind of just says, I actually do, I have them in my house and we feed them and care for them and help them get on their feet and advocate for them and take them to their appointments. And he says, I'm just kind of curious. You're very progressive. Do you do that? And they're like, oh no. So look, before you blast these evil capitalist, right-wing bigoted conservatives, maybe you ought to look at their lives what they're doing individually. And you might find out to your shock and hopefully to your chastisement that they're doing quite a lot for God's kingdom on an interpersonal level. They simply have a different view of government than you do. So just be careful about pronouncing judgment on them. And of course, vice versa. Just because you're conservative, don't blast these young idealistic, people that you think are wrong, but you can tell they're trying to do it out of love. You can oppose their politics, but still say their motives, I can tell, are good.
Okay. I think this would be a good last question, and then kind of wrap up.
Okay.
So early in your researching, you were talking about critical theory because terms like cultural Marxism had become radioactive, and because you wanted to discuss ideas rather than labels. How do you feel about the way CT and CRT have become the new boogeyman words, keeping people from ideas?
Yeah, people warned me about this, years ago. They were like, well, okay, cultural Marxism, you shouldn't use that word you're saying because people call it a boogeyman and people say it's invented and it's a conspiracy theory, it's anti-Semitic, blah, blah, blah. But, they're going to do that eventually with critical theory. So you're telling me we should use critical theory. It's more precise. And I said, yeah, you're probably right. And they were right. And I didn't deny that would happen. I actually said, yeah, you're right. It's going to happen. And it's happened. So what I face now is that I say, you shouldn't use the phrase cultural Marxism. They're like, that's right, it's a conspiracy theory. And I say, I really want to talk about, critical theory. Like, that's a conspiracy theory too. That's the Frankfurt School. It's been dead for 50 years. Okay, well, let's talk about critical race theory. That's a legal profession. It's purely legal scholarship. It's marginal. No one believes that anymore. Okay. How about critical social justice? That's just, no one uses that term. You're making that term up. D'Angelo invented that in 2012. And so, yeah, it's a headache, right? Because I don't care. You could call it, tapioca theory for all I care. Call it whatever theory you want, right? I'm telling you, in the literature, people refer to talk about critical social justice. They'll talk about critical theory, critical race theory, critical pedagogy. They'll use those words, and I'm trying to just be faithful to what they use. But if you want to call it something else, call it whatever you want. But I want to focus on the ideas. And what unfortunately I'm finding is people don't want to talk about those because they realize how hard it is to defend the ideas. They want to focus on labels. And so it's frustrating. I agree. And I'm doing my best to turn the discussion to the ideas and not the labels. But one really good way to do this, I have an article that I wrote called How to Preach Against Critical Race Theory. And in the introduction, I say, you should preach against critical race theory by not using the words critical race theory. And I say, why is that? Because if you use those words, people will immediately be like, you don't have a PhD, you're not qualified. I heard from so-and-so that it's a boogeyman. It's not a real thing. It's just a legal field. But here's what you can do. If you're a pastor, preach the Bible and preach the following. I list 6 biblical truths that are in the Bible that contradict the core tenets of critical race theory. So by not using that term and by preaching the Bible, you're forcing people to do what? To disagree with the Bible. And I'm not saying they should. I'm just saying that you move the discussion from this term or even this ideology to what does the Bible say? Make them disagree with Scripture, and then you can defend Scripture, or at least your interpretation of Scripture. But it's that you're arguing. Christians should be arguing it not about the latest theory. They should be arguing about what Scripture says. And I want to turn the conversation and have that conversation on those grounds. That's, I think, the most fruitful way you can have conversations on a one-on-one basis. Don't start telling people about, you believe in CRT, you believe in CSJ, you believe in queer theory. Just start saying, what do you think about this verse that says that, for example, we have to hear both sides of a story? What do you think about this verse in Leviticus that says to not show partiality to the poor, right? How are we implementing that? And how does that square with people saying things like, no, hold certain groups to different moral standards? What's okay for them to do is not okay for you to do. There are caveats, there are nuances there, but I think that's where the focus should be, on Scripture.
Great. Okay, so actually one more final overarching question.
Okay.
So if you could leave everyone tonight with just like one point or a few main points, just like quickly summarized, what would you say?
My main point for the whole talk was that Christianity is it's a world. It's not just it's a world. It's a way of thinking about reality, and it does ground concepts like morality and justice. And we know that justice is something that's important to God, and in particular, things that care for the vulnerable, the poor, the orphan, the widow, the stranger, the alien, the sojourner, basically immigrant. Those things are important to God. So as Christians, we should care about those things. And yet, all of those justice concerns are an outworking of the gospel, which is the message, the good news that Jesus died for our sins and rose from the dead. And that's the heart of Christianity. And if you take the gospel away, if you decentralize the gospel in any way and make it subordinate to justice, you will lose both the gospel and justice. You have to keep first things first. Keep the gospel central. Then from the gospel flow individual morality, flow corporate responsibility, flow things like just laws and shaping the culture. All of those things flow from the gospel. But the gospel has to be the center of our lives, of the church's witness, of all those things. So that's what my main message to you. And then sort of to non-Christians, beyond obviously repent and believe the gospel, would be on these issues, seek both sides out. Don't just listen to the woke people on either, and don't just listen to the anti-woke people. Listen to both. Ideally, if you can find them in dialogue, which is harder and harder to find these days, because if you only hear one side of the story, you're getting less than half the story because you're not hearing them respond to objections. It's very, if I give a talk, don't take my word for it. Honestly, I can say anything up here because I've studied this stuff, but you don't know where my arguments are weak. I'm monologuing. I'm answering questions, sure, I guess, but it's mainly monologue. Try to find debates, try to find dialogues. And again, unfortunately, critical theorists tend to avoid that. If you look at D'Angelo and Kendi, they're notorious for not doing public dialogues where they answer questions, but try to find them and be willing to hear both sides and then to reflect and try to think through which is true, which is closer to the truth, which reflects reality.
Great. Neil, thank you so much for your time. Thank you from us at U of M. Thank you from Grand Valley. They're saying it in the Q&A. And so, yeah, thank you so much for coming. And thank you to those of you who viewed it, whether you're viewing it now or whether you're viewing the recording. And so we also wanted to say we're going to post a few resources on the Facebook page relating to Neil. We'll post the video, like the recording of this lecture, and then we'll post a few of the references that Neil made during his talk. So if you're interested in some of the books he referenced, if you're interested in some of the YouTube videos, we'll be posting those on the Facebook page and the event page. So again, thank you very much, Neil, for doing this.
Thanks.